Well, good morning, good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I'm John Storpert, the Principal Director Marine at the International Chamber of Shipping, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this ICS leadership briefing. With recent advances in small modular reactor technology, interest in nuclear power for merchant ship propulsion and for floating nuclear power stations is growing. However, the legislative landscape for the sector is complex, and a clear understanding of the technology's potential depends on understanding the relationships between regulatory regimes and the processes and timelines for regulatory development. I am therefore delighted to welcome today's expert panel, who will help guide us through the current status and work in progress on this important topic. Before I introduce them formally, I'd just like to remind everyone that the discussion will be recorded and made available to registered participants after the meeting. We actively encourage you to participate by asking questions using the question function on your control panel, and thank you very much to those of you who've already sent your questions in advance. And so, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, I'm delighted to welcome my colleague Chris Waddington, the ICS Technical Director. Welcome, Chris. Next, a warm welcome to Toby Menzies, Secretary at the Nuclear Energy Maritime Organisation Limited, or NEMO for short. Welcome, Toby. Next, an equally warm welcome to Shehem Pagosian, Senior Nuclear Safety Officer and Technical Lead at the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA. Welcome, Shen. Also joining us is Mark Tipping, Global Power to X Director, Marine and Offshore at Lloyd's Register. Welcome, Mark. And completing our panel today is Kirsty Massey, Partner at Stevenson Harwood LLP. Welcome, Kirsty. So to begin the discussion, Chris, if perhaps I can start with you, can you give us a brief overview of the subject and perspective from ICS?
Yeah, thanks, John, and good day to everyone. And next slide, please. So firstly, please allow me to give a brief introduction to the International Chamber of Shipping. We were established in 1921, and we are the umbrella trade association for shipping. Our membership consists of 40 national ship owner associations, representing over 80% of the world merchant fleet. And we promote our members' interests at various international forums, including the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, and the International Labour Organization, World Trade Organization, etc. Next slide, please. So before we start the more detailed discussions, I just wanted to share ICS's views on this important topic. Although not a new concept, the idea of nuclear-powered ships has indeed aroused our members' curiosity. Generally, ship owners are considering all decarbonisation options and are open-minded, technology agnostic, and would like access to all clean, safe, and financially viable technologies. Indeed, nuclear propulsion appears well suited to the liner sector, where the regulatory aspects are limited to just 2 administrations. And notably, the September 2025 Memorandum of Understanding between the UK and USA governments included a commitment to explore opportunities for establishment of just such a nuclear maritime shipping corridor. With trade patterns that cross multiple jurisdictions, adoption by the tramp sector could be more challenging. Nevertheless, for the new fuels, for example, ammonia and methanol, it may initially be difficult to ensure bunkering facilities that align with charter contract destinations, or indeed to reliably have access to sequestration facilities for carbon capture. Hence, nuclear propulsion is also attractive to the tramp sector due to the very infrequent need for replenishment of nuclear fuel. Next slide, please. No doubt the heavy lift of decarbonisation will eventually come from hydrogen, ammonia and methanol. The supply of these is entirely dependent on the scarce resource of clean electricity. Therefore, we also recognise that floating nuclear power could contribute to relieving this bottleneck. Some would argue that due to their operation with a single jurisdiction, floating nuclear power will be easier and quicker to implement. And in this scenario, we envisage there could be beneficial spin-offs for nuclear propulsion. For example, in terms of availability of proven reactor technologies and accessing established supply chains for nuclear fuel. In June last year, the IMO's Maritime Safety Committee considered whether the IMO's Code of Safety for nuclear merchant ships should be updated to reflect the new reactor technologies. ICS, alongside other delegations, co-sponsored papers in support, and ICS is pleased that this has now been set in motion. Indeed, January's meeting of the IMO Subcommittee on Ship Design and Construction kicked off the review process, and a correspondence group will maintain the momentum. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, in short, ICS's policy towards nuclear merchant ships and floating nuclear power stations is to recognise them as potential contributors to the decarbonisation of shipping, and to closely follow the developing technologies and regulations, with our continuing support being dependent on robust assurance of safety and environmental protection. And we therefore welcome our guest speakers. On our journey of due diligence, there is much to learn and many challenging questions to address. Thanks, and back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks for giving us the context for our discussions today and outlining our members at ICS's perspective and interest in nuclear propulsion for shipping and where it might lead us in the overall decarbonisation strategy, which obviously is a huge priority for the industry now and in the future. So now, Toby, if I could turn to you, could you give us an overview of NEMO and its role in supporting regulators in the industry?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, John, and good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of NEMO, Nuclear Energy Maritime Organisation, I'm pleased to try and provide that overview. Firstly, very quickly, what NEMO is and why this matters. NEMO is a member-led NGO established in 2024, and we serve really as the industry association for maritime nuclear and the convening platform, if you like, for those who are working to make civil nuclear propulsion and floating nuclear power plants a practical reality. NEMO's membership is wide. It spans the whole breadth of the sector, including nuclear technology developers, ship owners and operators, shipyards, port authorities, classification, of course, insurers, legal experts, and also energy off-takers. So that breadth is not accidental. It's something that we've strived to build up, because the challenges ahead are not just purely technical. They span right across the regulatory, the legal, commercial, and institutional spheres. And solving those challenges will require every part of that ecosystem to move forward together. NEMO holds observer status at both the International Maritime Organization and holds the equivalent at the International Atomic Energy Agency, which places NEMO directly inside those top two regulatory bodies, which are most consequential to this section of the industry's future. And really, NEMO is focused on the practical enablers. That's port access, liability and insurance, safety assurance as well, and how classification fits in, with outcomes in each area really being driven by each of three working groups that NEMO has. If I could have the next slide, please. I'd like to just try and provide a quick snapshot of the state of the regulatory landscape, because the starting point is important. And these are the main areas that NEMO is active in. So as Chris mentioned at the IMO, that primary instrument that governs nuclear powered vessels remains SOLAS Chapter 8 and the Code of Safety for Nuclear Merchant Ships, which was adopted in 1981. And really it was designed for that very specific era. That was the era of state-owned pressurized water reactor propulsion programs, which in most cases didn't advance past single vessel demonstration projects. The nuclear code doesn't reflect advanced nuclear tech. It doesn't reflect modular design or modern risk-based methodologies. And in addition to all that, the port safety guidance that was relevant to nuclear shipping dates back even further to 1968, and already some years ago was written off and declared as officially obsolete. So work is underway, as we've heard, to change some of this. At the IMO, NEMO and its members are very engaged at both the level of the Maritime Safety Committee and the lower level, the Subcommittee on Ship Design and Construction, advancing those proposals to revise SOLAS Chapter 8 and the Nuclear Code, starting what will be a long process of moving from reactor-specific prescription to technology-neutral goal-based standards. Then at the IAEA, we'll hear more about this, I'm sure, but the Atlas initiative is getting established, hasn't quite been officially launched yet, but this will specifically address maritime and floating nuclear applications. I think Shahan's very likely to cover more on this, but the Atlas project groups are likely to cover various areas, including safety standards, safeguards, security, legal frameworks, and also deployment roadmaps. Because integrating concepts such as safeguards by design and security by design into vessel concepts at the earliest stage is really a central objective, and it's something that NEMO has already hosted workshops on, which have been attended by both these regulators. And then the final area, really, sort of civil liability. That's why we have that logo of the NEA there. That remains perhaps the single most immediate commercial constraint. Existing conventions for land-based nuclear largely cover coastal FMPPs, but they would exclude nuclear ships. So the Brussels Convention of 1962 attempted to address that, but it was never ratified. And really, without that viable liability corridor, if you like, and a pathway to insurability, the financial side and the underwriting for these assets will remain very difficult and constrained, regardless with what happens with technical progress. So to summarize all of this, really, the regulatory framework is largely present, but it's not quite yet fit for purpose for commercial deployment, at least in a short-term time frame. And that's really some of the gaps that we're working on to close. And if I could have my last slide, please. Just wanted to set out here, you can see in this slide some of NEMO's members. Just want to make the point that it's clear that the industrial actors are starting to get organized now, and also the regulators are becoming engaged. I think the strategic drivers behind the nuclear maritime agenda are also becoming quite well understood. Decarbonizing global shipping in line with IMO ambitions remains a massive challenge, and it will require nuclear power in some shape or form. Separately, you have the agenda around strengthening energy security and building energy resilience is perhaps actually an even bigger aspiration for some nations compared to just pure decarbonization. And feeding into this, you have the emergence of advanced reactor technology designed specifically for mobility with long or ultra long fuel cycles. It's been an important part of this as well. And really, maritime nuclear is starting to generally shift from the conceptual stage to industrial planning, with demonstration ambitions in or around the early 2030s, depending on the asset type. Really what's needed to realize those ambitions, I think, just to summarize everything, is clarity across three areas. First, it's that regulatory modernization. SOLAS Chapter 8 must be revised. Port acceptance processes need to be identified and defined, and security and safeguards frameworks must be adapted for assets that could move between a single jurisdiction. The second area is legal and liability reform. Ideally, we'd have a modern civil liability convention for nuclear powered ships, but realistically, that's a pretty long-term goal. I think before then, we need to establish bilateral corridors that demonstrate that insurability in practice. And then the third area relates to governance and coordination. That delineation we'll probably talk about later of the IMO and IAEA competencies and responsibilities, which will be supported by structured engagement from classification and insurers and ship operators as well. So the common effort, the central effort really is around harmonization. There's quite a few groups now putting their shoulder to this wheel. So it's going to be important to avoid duplication of work while ensuring that no regulatory gaps remain. I think Atlas, when it gets underway properly, will provide an important platform for some of those implementable outputs, but obviously it's going to require sustained technical and political support. So the task now is to deliver those things, the regulatory modernization, legal certainty and insurability but to do those things in parallel and not in series, one after the other. But that's all I have in terms of an introduction. So thank you very much and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Toby, and my apologies for my interruption. I think I had a Wi-Fi glitch at my end. That was a really helpful overview on the regulatory focus areas and the overlap between all of the different stakeholders. And from previous presentations I've seen Nemo give, I know there's a huge amount that needs to be done there. So Shahen, if I could turn to you now, could you outline IAEA's specific role and focus on the regulation of nuclear for merchant shipping and where things stand with respect to its current status?
Thank you, John, and greetings from Vienna, everyone. Yes, as a nuclear engineer, the topic of the transportable MPPs or floating MPPs, marine type applications in general, is really very exciting. And these reactors, these nuclear power plants, they exhibit unique features that must be addressed from safety demonstration point of view. And that's the focus here from the IAEA when we talk about nuclear safety. And the main tool, the main mechanism with which we are trying to reach out to member states and support is the part of our mandate, which is the IAEA safety standards. I will talk about them a lot during this webinar, and let me highlight the most I would say the most important feature of our safety standards is that they are consensus documents. Sometimes it takes a lot of time to produce one of our safety standards, but it's important that all the member states, all the stakeholders are on board, and the final version which we have as a safety standard published represent consensus among member states. Now, when we look to the transportable MPPs in general and floating in particular, the first question which was raised here at the IAEA is to what extent our safety standards are applicable to these technologies. Now I'm talking not only about the floating concepts, but to any innovative reactors, water-cooled, non-water-cooled innovative reactors. And therefore the IAEA launched an extensive project in, I think it was 2021, the first meeting we had, with involvement of more than 150 experts from many member states to review all IAEA safety standards in terms of applicability towards innovative technology, including floating nuclear power plants. And as a result of this project, we have Safety Report 123 published, so I encourage everyone to have a look on that, where basically one of the conclusions there is that IAEA safety standards in the area, for instance, design safety of nuclear power plants and safety assessment are largely applicable, are mostly applicable. We cannot see a major challenges for application for these reactors. However, we can see certain requirements and recommendations in our safety standards which require specific interpretation. And that's the area we are currently working on. And one of such kind of areas is, for instance, interfaces with the vehicle design, with the ship design, for instance, which is not explicitly covered in current safety standards. And you can see here behind me, somewhere here, the schedule of revision of our safety standards in the next coming years. And in this revision, transportable MPPs, floating MPPs will be one of the most important challenges to address. And we will make our safety standards even more further applicable, provide more guidance. And when doing that, we believe that cooperation with relevant stakeholders such as IMO, such as classification societies and others is very important. For instance, in terms of the interfaces when designing the ship, considering non-nuclear stakeholders. And for now, we are working on several detailed publications on design and safety assessment for floating MPPs. And there, the unique features of floating reactors are being considered. Those are leading to the new external hazards to analyze new potential accident scenarios, interfaces with ship design. And also we are trying to implement periodically capacity building activities. Last year we had a large meeting in China where we had many stakeholders and discussions on the topic. And that's what is happening now at the IAEA. What's next? I would like to highlight two aspects, and one of them was already mentioned by Chris, but the other one is IAEA peer review services. So IAEA is offering peer review services to review the design and review the safety case for the floating nuclear power plants, and that's a tool, a method through which IAEA can support reviewing against IAEA safety standards, all of these technologies, and we encourage member states to contact us on that. I would be happy to answer any questions in this regard. And another important initiative, the key milestone, is Atomic Technologies License for Application at Sea, ATLAS initiative. It's still not officially launched, but ATLAS is an important tool, as already mentioned by Chris. ATLAS will create a framework that promotes and supports the safe and secure development and deployment of peaceful forms of nuclear applications at sea, and it will be specifically focused on civil nuclear power ships and floating nuclear power plants. So these two activities I would like to highlight: IAEA peer review services and ATLAS, and happy to continue discussion on these items. Thank you, and back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Shahen. That was a very interesting overview of where things stand from the IAEA's perspective. We've heard now from two of our panel on the regulatory context and frameworks that are being developed. I'd now like to turn to Mark, who's spearheading initiatives for applying nuclear technologies in merchant fleets. So Mark, welcome. Where is the industry in respect to nuclear, and how does the technology fit into an overall decarbonisation strategy?
Right, well, that's several questions wrapped up into one. So I'm going to start at the end and finish at the beginning. Where does nuclear fit into a decarbonisation strategy? Well, it's zero carbon is really the first place to start with that. If you need to meet a zero carbon objective, it will do that. However, it goes further than that. The challenges with alternative fuels, and even potentially with fuels like LNG, can be access to the fuel and energy security. Where nuclear takes you is a zero carbon fuel that is also providing you with energy security. Depending on the technology, that could be 5 years between refueling, and we're working with clients who are in the space of 30 years between refueling as well. So it really gives you a much greater advantage here in that, yes, you can be seen to be showing that you're socially responsible, but you can do it in a way which is secure for your business, and indeed gain further advantage from the operational flexibility that that nuclear power plant gives you. So moving back to where we started and around where is the industry with the adoption of nuclear? And I'm sure we'll hear more about this later. There are already civil nuclear projects in the pipeline with planned operation in the early 2030s. But that's not the broad picture. There is a range of levels of awareness in the marine and floating communities around nuclear. And I would say that when we look at something like the container ship market, they have a much greater awareness of the potential for nuclear than other sectors. Now, I was actually earlier this week, in fact, the day before yesterday, speaking at the Cruise Line International Association conference in Madeira. And they're a bit further behind the journey on nuclear. But again, starting to see the potential that could potentially bring as well in a variety of different applications on ship and off ship as well. So on this journey, and taking it back 2 years ago when it was much earlier, there were fewer people interested, but we're seeing as more technologies are brought to the market for discussion, a much larger uptake of interest, but also potential wider adoption across the global fleet as well.
Thanks, Mark. So taking that point, what are the timescales and the scale of investment that's required?
Right, timescales, it's not instant. We're going to, I think, start with a few, and we often talk about seeing an S-curve, and I think that's exactly what we're going to see with nuclear and maritime, is an S-curve. Early 2030s, we will see a few. But it's also important to point out that the maritime industry is not developing nuclear power. This is happening in the wider nuclear industry for a much wider range of applications than just ships. The application to ships is just one. So we're going to see these reactors deployed before they come to the marine sector anyway. And we're going to see them manufactured at scale. And scale is the key word when we're talking about this, for both availability and the economics. It's when we see the factories built to start manufacturing in the hundreds and maybe the thousands, that's when we see that S-curve lift. And that, I suspect, could be coincidental with the deployment of some of the international regulation, which is mooted for around that 2035 period. It'll be very interesting to see how close those two are together. But that is a suspicion from what we're seeing at the moment as to when we see uptake at a greater scale. So slow in the early 2030s, rising as we see regulation and the availability of these reactors in the market.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I think questions are starting to come in, but I think you may well have answered the first one that we've received in from the participants. So thank you for that. Finally, just before I move on, what were the aims in setting up the UK Maritime Nuclear Consortium?
Right. I think it's worth noting that nuclear and maritime is not new. It's been going on for 70 years, more than 700 reactors deployed at sea. So this is an evolution, it's not a revolution. What we're doing here is showing how we can deploy nuclear in the civil maritime space. And the Maritime Nuclear Consortium aims to bring together a reactor developer in Rolls-Royce, an integrator into ships in the form of Babcocks, Lloyd's Register as an integrator of regulation and maritime and nuclear standards, Stevenson Harwood with Kirsty on what is the liability picture, the legal basis for operation of a nuclear powered ship, which also leads you then is to how do you insure the asset? If you can't insure an asset, you can't operate an asset. And finally, the one thing that is relatively new to civil nuclear and maritime, that security aspect, because it is paramount that we have robust security of reactors at sea. So our aim is to demonstrate that that can be achieved across a value chain. And obviously that will inform us as participating parties, but it will also inform governments as well as to where potentially they need to provide policy to support it, where maybe they need to provide additional regulation, and also for us then to be able to show to society that actually we're ready to do this, that it's a value chain, not a disparate contribution of different elements throughout industry.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a really, really comprehensive explanation of the direction of travel and all of the institutions that need to be involved to make this a success. So thank you very much. And you also very helpfully teed up Kirsty, who will conclude the panel introductions. You're also a member of the UK Maritime Nuclear Consortium. Can you give us a view, and Mark has already touched on this, of the liability issues that surround nuclear and maritime that you and your colleagues are working to address?
Yes, of course. So I think has been touched upon already from a legal and regulatory perspective. We've got to think of things in terms of safety and security, but also liability, which is the big point. As Toby mentioned, there's a patchwork of regulation in the nuclear context. So you've got the Paris Convention, Vienna, Brussels, joint protocols. You've also got national legislation which has implications for liability. Now, much of the nuclear legislation is quite dated, and in particular relates to old technologies. And as Mark has mentioned, we're looking at new technologies, which does require us to reassess the regulation and the liabilities. It's also true to say that the existing nuclear regulation that we have specifically does not apply to maritime nuclear propulsion in the maritime context. Floating nuclear power plants are slightly different, although it's not entirely clear. I think there's views that Vienna is supportive, but it's, but in the propulsion context, what we find is we have a policy and regulatory gap that we're trying to fill. That being said, from a liability perspective, that existing patchwork of regulation is actually really quite helpful, because it establishes some important liability principles which we may be able to adapt and leverage in the maritime context. So, for example, we've got strict liability for operators. Now, what an operator means in a maritime context is probably a little bit more complicated than it is if you're thinking of an onshore nuclear facility. The regulation also imposes caps on liability or limits on liability, both in terms of amount, the time for bringing claims, and importantly, there's a government sort of backstop underpinning the liability regime. Again, how do we translate that in and make it appropriate for the maritime context? It also, the regulations are very helpful in terms of providing clarity as to the relevant courts to have jurisdiction. Now, that's going to be important if you're thinking about a movable asset that's going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So we've got sort of some liability principles. We know there's a gap in terms of nuclear propulsion in maritime context. We've got to also overlay with this the maritime regulations, which really do focus significantly on safety, security, and security, and then adapt that for the contractual matrix, which is really quite complex in the maritime world. But I think, as Mark has said, we're not starting from scratch here. There are some important principles. We can look back to the Savannah and the bilateral exchange of notes, the bilateral agreement that was put in place for the Savannah. We've got some good starting points. It's just really teasing those out and making sure that they work in the maritime context.
Thank you, Kirsty. So what then, in your view, are the most pressing issues that require attention and input from the industry?
So I think for me, the pressing issues are sort of this cooperation between regulators in terms of the ONR and the nuclear regulator in the UK and the maritime MCA, the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, getting those two regulators to work together, because this is going to be a collaborative effort to get this across the line. I think we've also, from an insurance perspective, got to understand how the insurance elements come together, because we've already got nuclear risk insurance that is applicable and up and running in the context of onshore insurance. We've got P&I clubs very, very familiar with the maritime sector. The question is how those come together to provide the appropriate insurance cover in the maritime context, but also, for me, importantly, getting a feel and clarity as to the government support and backstop. If we look at what's happened in the US, typically there's been sort of government support. That being said, up until now, we've been looking at sort of in the defence sector is where we've typically seen nuclear used. Translating that into the civil sector is different. So I do think we need to make sure that we're clear as to the government support, and that may come through bilateral agreements.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. That was very, very helpful. And again, you've answered some of the questions that are coming in from the floor already, which is very, very encouraging. We've now got 25 minutes to answer the questions that we've received so far, and for a general discussion about how this important industry is going to move forward in this technological solution. Going back to the timelines for regulation and the requisite requirements and frameworks. I wonder what timelines do the panel members see themselves working to, and what do they think is viable? Mark has already identified 2035 as a likely deadline for regulation. So I wonder what the views are in the context of the panelist worlds. Chris, you're close to the IMO work on this, so maybe you can tee us off.
Yeah, thanks, John. So the work plan for the revision of the Code of Safety for Nuclear Merchant Ships and the relevant parts of SOLAS was first discussed at SDC 12 in January, and a draft work plan was prepared, which we hope will be endorsed at MSC 111 later this year. The work will span multiple MSC meetings and SDC, Ship Design and Construction meetings. And according to the work plan, the adoption of the SOLAS amendments and the nuclear code is targeted for MSC 118 in 2030. But I did hear Mark's comment that he thought 2035, so I'd be interested to hear Mark's views as well. And of course, this is also very much interrelated with IAEA and also the liability aspects. But yeah, just focusing on IMO, my understanding is the target date for adoption of the relevant guidelines and regulations is 2030. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Chris. I think, Mark, the ball was passed definitely there to you, and then Shahen. So perhaps you could give your views.
Indeed, and obviously we're very encouraged to hear the deadlines of 2035. But in addition to that, that's then got to go back to national regulations. And as Kirsty has very eloquently pointed out, we need cooperation between national nuclear and national maritime organisations to tie this together as a single function. And maybe we're being a little bit pessimistic there, but I also like to think, you know, it's always worthwhile bringing in a little bit of a buffer in your thinking. We still think 2035 for wide scale adoption is more realistic than the early 2030s around that, because there are those other challenges as well. There are the ports to consider, the regulation for the ports. Now, it won't stop the first movers from moving without regulation with bilateral agreements, but we very much see that it's going to take a little bit longer to get there, because we're interested in a wide-scale adoption here, which is why we're thinking that little bit longer.
Dan, that's clear. I think the question of how ports will react to accommodate this new technology is very, very significant, and fits into the wider question of decarbonisation and hubs, and how that industry is going to move to meet the new requirements of international trade. Shahen, you were also teed up by Chris, so it'd be interesting for IAEA's perspective on this, and also whether you feel that the division of responsibility between IMO and IAEA is clearly defined at the moment.
Yeah, I think that the IAEA and IMO have a clearly defined mandate, and what is important at this stage is to we are cooperating. IMO and IAEA is cooperating for a long time, but I think at this stage it's very important to intensify this cooperation. And one of the opportunities is IMO code, and second is our safety standards, where we, as I mentioned, we are going to systematically incorporate floating and maritime applications in our safety standards, looking to floating MPPs and also propulsion concepts. And that's where we think without cooperation with IMO, it would be really difficult and not effective to achieve. And another aspect is Atlas, where not only IMO, but IAEA and IMO will bring together the stakeholders required to build such a framework. For instance, nuclear regulators, maritime regulators, classification societies, shipbuilders, reactor developers, and others. So I believe that in these two areas, the work between IAEA and IMO should be intensified, and according to current plans, it will be.
Thank you very much. Do we feel, and perhaps Kirsty, you will have a view on this, and I imagine Toby as well, do we feel that the processes for achieving the framework are adequately resourced now, or do they need further input?
So I think resource and focus and getting people's attention is always tricky. I think achieving the international framework is obviously the gold standard that we're all looking to achieve. It will take a lot of collaboration, a lot of commitment and time and effort. I do think with regulators in the UK, ONR, MCA, both extremely well respected regulators, but have constraints on their resource and the demands on their time. So that's always a problem. The one thing that does is always with me though, is that we do need to push forward. We have a great opportunity now to develop these frameworks and set the standards as appropriate. If we don't and we hesitate, there is always a risk that some other entity fills that gap and that we are perhaps subject to standards, or we're on the back foot. And if we don't get things sorted and really push forward, we may find that we're not as in control of the direction of travel as we would want to be.
Thank you, Kirsty. Toby, what are your views?
Yeah, I think I'd largely agree with what Kirsty said, and I think just on the broader question of adequate resourcing, I think the answer is probably we're not adequately resourced yet. The short answer. I think that lack of resources probably applies also in several areas, not just one area. Obviously, the IMO and the IAEA both rely quite heavily on voluntary contributions of expertise from member states and industry to drive some of that technical work. I think that model works well for established domains, terrestrial nuclear in particular, but because maritime nuclear is still, is genuinely still novel, although we have had it for many years, but that shift into the commercial space is novel, and it's complex and it's quite cross-cutting. I think that's going to require more sustained resources than the current process basically provides. Now, the Atlas initiative is also in itself likely to need some extra budgetary contribution. We would expect from participating member states and from other stakeholders. And part of NEMO's function, I guess, is to potentially fill some of that gap. Not so much on pure financial funding, although NEMO is obviously always actively exploring different sort of grant opportunities that might exist in this space, but more by providing sort of consistent technical input and secretariat type support across both the regulators and the bodies. But I think the broader question of dedicated resourcing for this what is basically a regulatory challenge is one that the industry and its member states will need to answer quite seriously if that timeline is going to be met.
Thank you, Toby. I think that raises a very, very interesting point, and one of my questions is, looking at it from the shipping side and the view of this is to facilitate trade ultimately, how will port state control operate with respect to nuclear shipping? And this is true, it's not just for nuclear, it's true for a lot of other alternative fuels potentially, but nuclear, I think, has a rarefied place in many people's thinking. So do we see port state control continuing as it currently does? It's principally an IMO concern, or do we see that checks will need to be conducted for both IMO and IAEA compliance, or is that not a question we can answer at the moment? I don't know if anybody has the answer for that.
I'm prepared to give it a go. I wouldn't call it the answer. What I would say is that nuclear power chips going into port are going to be different to what we have seen before. And invariably that is going to require nuclear regulation on that side from a port perspective. The port has to be satisfied with the safety of that nuclear asset that is visiting it. So I think as we're seeing develop with the IEA and the IMO now, we're going to need to have verification of the assets on board. As in, when it comes to individuals doing that, it could be an individual representing more than one regulator in practice and more than one interest. I think that's entirely reasonable. But I think it's also important to note that in many ways a nuclear power chip visiting a port is simpler than some of the other energy alternatives in terms of the physical requirements, not in terms of the regulation. That is something that still very much needs to be addressed. But it's not one of those things that keeps me awake at night. It's something that I think we can address, and it will naturally evolve as we get that port engagement in this process.
Yeah, can I jump in there just quickly, because this whole area of safeguards by design is very, very important. It's something that we think quite a great deal about. I mean, traditional port state control, of course, already built around maritime inspectors checking IMO instruments, and nuclear powered ships will need to demonstrate that extra level of compliance with a separate body of agency standards on safeguards and security. So really, by introducing civil maritime nuclear propulsion to shipping, you're inevitably bringing nuclear licensing to maritime. And I think what will be an important development here is how that expands the role of the flag state, that is actually flying the flag of that vessel that has that reactor and that nuclear fuel on board, and to an extent the port state. Most port state control authorities won't have nuclear qualified inspectors on hand to just call on exactly where and when they need them. And I think it's unrealistic to expect them to develop that capability as well. One potential model in the future could be a sort of a pre-approved port access package. I think that was possibly what Mark was maybe alluding to, where IAEA and flag state compliance is verified upstream and certified, and then port state control checks that certification rather than actually conducting independent nuclear assessments. But that said, the IAEA will always have the right to verify that those systems and seals on board those ships are intact, and that the fuel inventory hasn't changed. So I think there will always need to be the ability to have safeguards inspections coordinated, and I see a role there for classification and other bodies in facilitating that.
Thank you, Toby. And Shahan, you had something to contribute.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, Toby already covered most important aspects regarding the safeguards. About the safety, I would like to continue on what Mark was saying, that yes, the nuclear power plant, floating nuclear power plant or propulsion concept, maritime application, it's considered to be still a nuclear power plant. And we expect that the requirements which we have in our safety standards to the design of such nuclear power plants are still need to be satisfied. And as I mentioned, the applicability review shows that even the requirements for NPPs, which are land-based and stationary, are largely applicable for the design safety of these reactors. And therefore, we expect the safety assessment to be done in a similar manner according to IAEA safety standards. We are currently revising the safety standards so to provide even more further guidance on that. But also I would like to, beyond the safety, I would like to comment on the interfaces between safety, security, and safeguards. And Toby already covered the point about safeguards, but also security is an important aspect in this regard. And one of the overarching requirements we have for design of any nuclear power plant or even any nuclear facility is that the safety measures, security measures, and safeguards measures arrangements, they need to be done in an integrated manner in order to avoid having conflict between and adverse effects from one to another, which is the best to be done in the design stage of these facilities.
I mean, if I may
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right and well said. And I do think, just coming back to a point I think Mark made earlier, that some of the nuclear technology development is also being seen on land. And some of the new technologies that we're seeing, whether it's sort of, which are also proposed for maritime, so molten salt, high temperature, HALEU fuel, accident tolerant fuel, all of these are issues. I mean, they're probably more Gen 4 plus, but advanced modular reactors, these are also things that are being considered by regulators for onshore applications. And that whole consideration around, can you the design approval and the factoring in of safety, security and safeguard issues in that context. I think there is movement in the onshore context which will help and assist with the maritime application as well. We don't want to keep reinventing the wheel, and we don't want multiplicity of standards here, there and everywhere. I mean, the regulatory regime is complicated enough as it is. Let's not compound the problem.
Thank you very much. I appreciate we're beginning to run out of time, and I have to start wrapping up soon. But we've had an awful lot of questions in from the floor, and thank you very much for those. We won't be able to answer all of them individually, but hopefully the conversation is touching on many of the points that have been raised. One question we do have is, how will the framework govern the use of nuclear fuel and the disposal of spent nuclear fuel? How will that be implemented and regulated? And one of the questions we have received is that while regulations for commercial nuclear shipping are being developed, and in order to already address concerns of ever-growing stockpiles of used fuel, how do you as a panel view the consideration of encouraging the use of fuel compatible with future recycling rather than the use of very hard to recycle fuels? I don't know who, if anybody, wants to address that first.
I'm quite happy to, because I think the question is spot on. That, in fact, any of the energy systems we look at should be full life cycle approaches. So we should be looking from cradle to grave on every element of it. And it's our belief that wherever these assets operate, that you will not be able to start building them unless you have a full disposal pathway for those materials at end of life. And it's also worth noting that these systems are being designed so that there is a minimal amount of material at end of life as well, and also that hazard is managed. Most people look back to the times in the 50s and 60s when material was generated without a thought for what we do with it. Certainly from a Lloyd's Register perspective and the integration framework that we have developed, that actually to get onto that pathway, you need to be thinking about the end of the journey as you're starting the beginning of the journey.
Thank you, Mark.
I think...
Oh, sorry, Kirsty and then Chris.
I think that's exactly right. And I think, again, what's happening in the nuclear space onshore, it will inform that. We've got different types of waste. The disposal of and long-term storage of waste is something that is considered. And I think that will inform what happens. I mean, we do have to think about it. If you're looking at a nuclear site onshore, from the moment you start building, you've got to have a decommissioning plan in place. That's just the way it works in the nuclear space. And I anticipate, as Mark said, that longer term cradle to grave approach is going to be needed.
Thanks, Kirsty. And Chris, to finish up on this before we wrap up the session.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's a very good question. And personally, I'd like to see a bigger focus on the recycling aspect. I know, for example, the UK nuclear submarines, there's been a long-running program figuring out how to decommission those, and they're just running the first pilot at the moment. And there's a queue of Polaris submarines waiting to be decommissioned, but it's looking like a pretty expensive exercise. Now, of course, merchant ships, normally they go through several owners, and usually the end user is probably the least financially able to pay for any recycling. But fortunately, usually the recycling process is cash positive. So whatever the financial state of the owner, there's money in the value of the ship to recycle it. But I don't think that's necessarily the case with nuclear ships. The expectation probably is that there would be a cost associated with the recycling. So I think it's worth thinking about that as well. How do we ensure that this potentially new fleet of ships, there's finance available to recycle them at the end of their lives? Thanks, John.
That's Chris, and I agree. As somebody well versed in ship recycling, we do have the benefit of time in planning for that in terms of design and awareness, so that these can be recycled quickly and safely and in an economically viable fashion. We are fast running out of time, so I'd like to give each of the panel members, we're now less than 1 minute, to give a couple of the points on what key messages they'd like our audience to remember from our discussion today. Shehan, would you like to go first?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, then from IEA perspective, maybe I would like to highlight that we believe that our safety standards is a great tool to support that framework about which we discussed today, and happy to answer offline to any interest from the participants. And also one more thing, it was highlighted here and there during our discussion that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So in many cases, these technologies were operated, maybe sometimes in military, sometimes not for other purposes, but there are a lot of experience accumulated which we need to learn from. And for that, we are organizing a special conference when we will have a different panel sessions, one of which will be on floating MPPs, and it will be in June in Vienna. And the motto of this conference is learning from the past to accelerate the future. So that's a good chance to invite everyone in June to Vienna for TIC 2026 conference. Let's continue there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kirsty, your closing remarks.
I think it's clarification on government support underpinning a lot of this. That not just in an indemnity perspective or a sort of liability context, but also supporting coordination of regulatory bodies to roll this out efficiently and in a well thought out manner.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. Chris, closing words.
Thanks, John. Yeah, as we said right at the start, I think there's potentially an opportunity for an option for decarbonisation here, or several opportunities. I think industry ourselves, we need to be a critical friend to the proponents, continue to ask the difficult questions, extend our understanding, and only continue to support this whilst we're sure that it can be safe, environmentally friendly, and secure, and financially viable, of course. We need to continue to carry out our own due diligence on this, but very grateful to the speakers. I've certainly learnt a lot from the discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and likewise. Mark, your closing words?
I think I'm going to echo what some of the other panelists said already, but in my own phrase, evolution, not revolution. 700 reactors at sea before. We do actually know what we're doing. We just need to translate that into a civil context. And I was remiss in one of my earlier questions talking about the Maritime Consortium. I mentioned everybody but two very important partners, Global Nuclear Security Partners and North Standard P&I. And I think Kirsty was very eloquent in explaining why they're so important to this process.
Thank you very much, Mark. And Toby, the last words to you before I close the discussion.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that's a nice segue from Mark, actually, because my sort of key takeaway I want to just pick up on probably, and I'll leave it with one, is around the liability and insurability piece. And it's obviously something Kirsty's covered really well, but you mentioned the P&I clubs. That this element is really the key commercial constraint. If we're looking at the various bottlenecks that exist, or the various hurdles, this is the key one. You can have all the technical readiness you like, but it won't unlock that financing and underwriting element which you have to have. So we need to develop these civil liability corridors. I think bilateral initially is the way to go, trilateral subsequently, followed by regional, and then multilateral is the longer term goal. And you have to do that in parallel with the regulatory reform.
Thank you very much, Toby. I think that puts a neat bow on our discussions today. Thank you, everyone, for a great discussion. There's been plenty for us to consider. My apologies to the audience. There were a huge number of questions. We will endeavour to answer those that we didn't have time to cover. Before we do close, I'd like to remind everyone that the next edition of the Leadership Insights Live webinar series will be on wind-assisted propulsion on Thursday, 19th of March at 1200 UK time. All that remains for me is to thank our distinguished panelists for their active engagement in sharing their perspectives with us. And to all of you in the audience, we appreciate you taking the time to join us today and engaging so actively. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.